This is Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Neve Barker. This is the Al Jazeera NewsHour live from London. Coming up, France extends its nighttime curfew to 46 million people as coronavirus cases continue to surge there and around Europe. President Trump's Supreme Court nominee moves a step closer to confirmation as he prepares to face Joe Biden for their second and final debate. Plus,
your voice has been heard, loud and clear.
After another day of unrest in Lagos, Nigeria's president calls for an end to the protests but doesn't address Tuesday's shooting by security forces. And Saad Hariri becomes Lebanon's prime minister for a fourth time, a year after the protests that pushed him out of power. France is extending its curfew on 9 major cities to a further 38 areas, meaning 46 million people will now have to stay indoors at night for 6 weeks. After following Spain in passing 1 million confirmed coronavirus cases, it's now recorded an all-time high of 41,500 new infections in 24 hours. Germany, Croatia and Russia are 3 of the other European countries who also posted their biggest one-day rise in infections. Belgium's Foreign Minister Sophie Wilms, who was caretaker Prime Minister until recently, is now in intensive care with the virus. The country had on average nearly 10,000 new cases each day last week, despite a population of just 11 million. It's second only to the Czech Republic in Europe in terms of infections per capita. Thursday saw new limits on movement and the closure of shops and hotels as hospitals fill up there. And in Slovakia, all schools will be closed for a month from Monday, and there'll be 2 rounds of population-wide testing. Jonah Hull has more on the situation around Europe.
These pictures, filmed anonymously and leaked onto social media, herald a ghastly return to the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic in Europe. Bodies wrapped in black plastic, apparently filmed a week ago in the basement of a Siberian hospital. They're said to be awaiting autopsy. The voice behind the camera says all of them had the virus. Russia's health services are under severe strain in places, with the toll of daily deaths and infections rising to record highs. It's a familiar story across Europe, now firmly in the grip of pandemic once again. Both Spain and France have exceeded 1 million cases of COVID-19, with more French cities and 2/3 of the population placed under nighttime curfew.
The coming weeks will be tough. Our hospital services will be put to the test, and the number of deaths will continue to rise.
And Italy, the country where dramatic pictures of the sick and dying were a glimpse of Europe's future in the spring, is posting its own record daily infection numbers in the autumn.
Around mid-May, the situation was quiet and remained so for a couple of months. Now we are completely saturated. At the moment, we're not able to receive anyone. We only have 4 beds left in the intensive care unit.
In Germany, where effective testing from the start has helped the country fare better than most, the infection is said to be back with full force. Health authorities have warned of an uncontrolled escalation.
I'm very sad and thoughtful about this. I suspect we will have to face even more restrictions, but I think it's justified. We have to live with this pandemic in some way.
A field hospital in the Czech Republic, the country in effective lockdown after the government brought back measures introduced earlier in the year. Balkan countries are seeing steep rises too. And Belgium says it's facing a tsunami of infections, with political figures not immune. 45-year-old Sophie Wilms, Deputy Prime Minister, is in a Brussels hospital undergoing emergency treatment in intensive care. Her condition is described as stable. The same cannot be said for the pandemic across Europe. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera.
The Spanish government has overwhelmingly survived a confidence vote in Parliament over its handling of the pandemic. The motion had been brought by the far-right Vox party, but it failed to win any other support and was rejected by 298 votes to 52. The minority coalition government of Pedro Sanchez has faced criticism over its policies, but the result is being seen as the main conservative opposition party distancing itself from the far right. The South African government is warning of a potential second wave of COVID-19 cases. That's after a 42% rise in 2 weeks in and around its second largest city, Cape Town. South Africa eased the strict lockdown last month. Famida Miller in Johannesburg has more on the government's strategy.
Well, South Africa until this point has adopted what it's called a risk-adjusted strategy. And at the height of the pandemic, around June, July and August, South Africa was between level 5, level 4 and 3 in the strategy, and now has moved down to level 1, which is the easiest or the most lenient level in the strategy. Now most social events are allowed. They've increased the number of people that can visit restaurants, bars, that can attend funerals. And this is the concern from the government, that because the pandemic has now been around for so long, people are increasingly complacent. They're not wearing masks properly. They're not adhering to social distancing. And the major concern, I think, for the government at this point are these social events, specifically nightclubs and bars. You've mentioned that in Cape Town there was a 42% increase in the last couple of weeks. And one of the concerns there is a bar in Cape Town that is considered a super spreader, where at least 80 people were infected there. We saw something similar in the Eastern Cape, where students were infected at university. And so the health minister, Willem Kizi, is saying that complacency, the easing of restrictions, is leading to what could inevitably be a second surge. And this is what the leading expert in South Africa is saying around the pandemic and what South Africa potentially could face going forward.
In the United States, the daily death toll has passed 1,200 for the first time since August. COVID-19 deaths had been running at around 700 a day for most of October, but this spike was expected after the number of new cases started rising 5 weeks ago. The US is the worst hit country with more than 220,000 deaths since the outbreak started. The antiviral drug remdesivir has been approved to treat COVID-19 patients in the US. The country's Food and Drug Administration says the drug will be used by those requiring hospitalization. Remdesivir was one of the drugs used to treat Donald Trump. It's become the standard of care for patients with severe COVID-19 in the US after a major study showed that it reduced time in hospital. But just last week, a World Health Organization-sponsored study found remdesivir did not help patients survive or recover faster. Now, the US Senate Judiciary Committee has voted to subpoena the chief executives of Twitter and Facebook over allegations of censorship. The move comes after the social media platforms decided to block recent stories from the New York Post, which made unverified claims about Joe Biden's son. The tech CEOs are already set to testify before the Senate Commerce Committee next week about alleged bias and privacy matters. The head of Google is also due to testify. President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, has moved a step closer to being confirmed.
The votes are 12 yeas, 10 no votes.
The nomination will be reported favorably to the floor with a unanimous vote.
The Senate Judiciary Committee approved her nomination, even though the Democrats boycotted the ballot. It will now go to a full Senate vote on Monday. The Republicans hold a majority, making Barrett's confirmation look all the more certain. One of the issues likely to come up is the ideological makeup of the Supreme Court, which at the moment has a conservative majority. Biden was asked on the CBS 60 Minutes program whether he would pack the nation's top court with liberal judges. This was his response.
If elected, what I will do is I'll put together a national commission bipartisan commission of scholars, constitutional scholars, Democrats, Republicans, liberal, conservative, and I will ask them to, over 180 days, come back to me with recommendations as to how to reform the court system, because it's getting out of whack.
Well, there's a big showdown looming because just under 4 hours, Donald Trump and Joe Biden will go head-to-head in their second and final US presidential debate. Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett joins us live from the debate venue in Nashville, Tennessee. Kimberly, it is an incredible meeting of minds that we're expecting a little bit later on. What is the mood music like ahead of this all-important debate?
Yeah, well, we're here on the campus of Belmont University in the southeastern United States of Tennessee, the state that many are going to be watching very closely around the United States and around the world as both Donald Trump, the U.S. president, and the Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden will hit the stage at the same time for the final time before the November 3rd election. So there's a lot of anticipation about what is going to happen in the next few hours. We know that what these men are going to be doing is kind of making their closing arguments to the American voters that have not yet voted. And of course, we know that the number of early voters is surging in the United States in record numbers, more than 40 million Americans now casting their ballots. But for those that have not yet, what we expect is that Joe Biden will be hammering Donald Trump on his handling of the coronavirus pandemic in the United States. And for his part, we expect Donald Trump to bring up questions about Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and some of his business dealings. But the big question in all of this is, during this 90-minute debate that will be a range of domestic and foreign policy issues, will Donald Trump dial back the aggression that we saw from him in the first debate?
You shut up, man.
The first presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, according to many political analysts, was a low point in the 2020 U.S. election.
Because you weren't president screwing things up.
The U.S. president repeatedly interrupted his Democratic rival and also the moderator.
Sir, Chris, that was the worst part of it.
And just 3 days later, Trump was in the hospital after testing positive for COVID-19, raising questions about whether or not he knew he was infected with the virus when he took to the debate stage. Trump's refusal to do a virtual debate led to the cancellation of the second presidential matchup. Instead, both nominees participated in their own separate town halls at the same time and on the same night. But now with the final debate set to take place in Nashville, there are questions about Trump's tactics and whether he'll take an aggressive stance, as he did in the first debate.
Americans saw that and they didn't like it. It looked out of control. It looked bullying. It looked disrespectful, not just of Biden, but of the entire electoral process. And so I don't think it would be the best thing for him to try to do that again.
One notable change this time, the campaigns agreed to an uninterrupted rule, which means the microphone of the candidate who doesn't have the floor will be muted. Trump isn't happy about the change and has repeatedly attacked the debate commission and the next moderator as biased against him. Earlier this week, the Trump campaign sent out a letter to the debate commission complaining it changed the focus of the debate from foreign policy, adding more domestic issues like COVID-19 and racial injustice. Meanwhile, Biden has spent the week at home without any public events. Analysts believe he has the most to lose by a poor showing in the final presidential debate.
He'll be entering the debate with a sizable and consistent lead. And the danger for a candidate in that position is, what if you do or say the wrong thing in response to the wrong question in a way that fundamentally upends the way people look at your campaign?
It's the undecided voter that candidates often try to win over in a presidential debate. But there are fewer undecided voters this year than in 2016. With early voting surging, most have already made up their mind about who they want to win on Election Day.
And Kimberly, as if things weren't thorny enough already, we're hearing that President Trump is pushing to rapidly declassify a document disputing a U.S. intelligence finding in 2017 that Russia acted to help elect Trump.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And leading this charge is the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe. And there are some real questions about the timing of this request. Now, not only is there a push to declassify this, but there is once again an allegation that the president simply doesn't trust the findings of his own intelligence agency, something that has been a recurring theme throughout Trump's time in office. We should point out that there is resistance to releasing this intelligence, to declassifying or making it public. And it's coming from inside the intelligence agencies, because the feeling of officials inside those agencies is that we're just too close to the November election, that sources could be compromised, even that there could be concerns to national security. Now, Democrats are charging that in all of this, that what's really happening here is the Trump administration is politicizing the intelligence for sort of an effort to try and get Donald Trump re-elected. This is something that they are discounting, but at the same time, we should also note that John Ratcliffe also had a hastily called press conference about 24 hours ago, where he once again brought up concerns about election integrity, pointing to Russia and Iran, saying that there has been some meddling. So it's clear that there may be an attempt by the Trump administration and Donald Trump supporters to kind of inject some uncertainty about the election, basing it on some of the concerns from 2016 and building upon that. Again, Democrats wondering why now? And so we'll have to see if the U.S. president brings this up when they hit the debate stage in a little more than 3 hours' time. What I can tell you is that this is really the last chance for Donald Trump to try and close that gap, because, of course, Joe Biden has the lead right now, something that he's trying to hang on to and essentially run out the clock before November 3rd.
Kimberly Halka in Nashville, Tennessee, on another very big day in American politics. Thank you very much. And you can watch the final US presidential debate in full here on Al Jazeera from 0100 GMT on Friday. Now, the Sri Lankan MPs have expanded the powers of the president, allowing him to dissolve parliament and giving him immunity from prosecution. And official results give a landslide win to Guinea's President Alpha Condé, but the opposition refuses to accept the decision. Nigeria's president has addressed the nation after more than 2 weeks of protest against police brutality. Muhammadu Buhari called for an end to the demonstrations after a day where prison and other locations across Lagos were set on fire. But he didn't mention the shooting of protesters on Tuesday. Ahmed Idris reports from Abuja.
For days, the president has been under pressure to speak to a nation on the edge. After meeting the country's top security officials on Thursday, he asked security forces to act within the confines of law to halt the rising violence across the country.
We shall continue to ensure that liberty and freedom, as well as the fundamental rights of all citizens, are protected. But remember that government also has the obligation to protect lives and properties, as well as the right of citizens to go about their daily businesses freely and protected from acts of violence.
For more than 2 weeks, demonstrators, mainly young men and women, took to the streets demanding an end to police brutality, compensation for victims, and the reform of Nigeria's police force. They also want officers guilty of extrajudicial killings, torture, and disappearances to be prosecuted and punished. In a shocking move captured on mobile phones by witnesses, security personnel used live rounds on demonstrators on Tuesday after a curfew was announced in Lagos. Obianuju Elonya has been part of the NSAS protest since it started. Her brother, missing for 12 years, was last seen in the custody of the now disbanded rogue police unit at the center of the protests. She watched the president's address on television and is personally not impressed.
The president doesn't have any respect for us. The president doesn't rate us. He doesn't think our lives are worth it. But we have to make him understand that we know what we are asking for and we are going to get what we are asking for, regardless of how he feels about it.
She said the protesters will meet and decide their next line of action. All day Thursday, security personnel were kept busy as mobs attacked police stations, looting and burning properties across the city. Here, one of Nigeria's main prisons, the Ikoyi Correctional Facility, is on fire. Security officials say they foiled an attempt to set the prisoners free. It's the fifth prison to be attacked in 3 days. In Edo, scene of the first mass prison escape, more than 1,700 prisoners are still at large. The past 2 weeks have been some of the most difficult for this nation of over 200 million people since its return to democracy in 1999. And the next few days will be critical in determining whether the president's pronouncements are enough to calm the situation. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, Abuja.
Sri Lanka's president now has expanded powers after the parliament overwhelmingly approved an amendment to the constitution. Gotabaya Rajapaksa will now be able to dissolve parliament before its term finishes and has full immunity from prosecution. He'll also have the power to appoint key officials, including some judges. The opposition had urged the government to withdraw the legislation, which critics say will impose autocratic rule. Manel Fernandez has the reaction from Colombo.
The Rajapaksa bandwagon, which began with Gotabaya Rajapaksa contesting the presidency, he went to the people asking for a mandate, essentially to make the necessary changes to the constitution to allow him to do what's necessary for this country, to repose that confidence. And essentially the people voted en masse for him. And we're seeing that essentially indication of that coming to fruition in the parliament. 156 MPs voting to change the constitution as opposed to 65 voting against it. This obviously brings that huge sweeping range of powers back under the umbrella of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the current executive president of Sri Lanka. He has the power to appoint, to dismiss the prime minister, any minister. He has the power obviously to take on any ministerial portfolio, to make sweeping appointments to a wide range of institutions, very sensitive institutions, the judiciary, the police commission, essentially also the whole system of appointments for which the previous government in the 19th Amendment had set up a constitutional council has been done away with now. There's a parliamentary council, but essentially most of those decisions and the power rests with the one man, the executive president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa.
Saad Hariri has again been named Lebanon's prime minister, with the country in the grip of a political and economic crisis. His appointment was announced after consultations between Lebanon's president and various political groups. Hariri resigned from the job last year following anti-government protests. Zaina Hodder has more.
Saad Hariri has returned to power. The three-time prime minister was appointed to form a government after receiving enough votes from Lebanon's parliamentarians. It will be the first anniversary next week of his resignation during the unprecedented popular uprising that called for, among other things, a new leadership. That movement failed to bring change. But Hariri is promising to stop the collapse of the economy and provide a new way forward.
I thank my fellow MPs and especially those who honoured me by naming me, by forming as quickly as possible a new non-partisan government of experts with a mission of economic, financial and administrative reforms contained in the French initiative roadmap. We have a chance, possibly the last chance.
Lebanon is facing multiple crises. The economy is collapsing. The local currency crashed. There is rising poverty and unemployment. The state, which is close to bankruptcy, is in desperate need of financial assistance. The international community is conditioning aid to a reform-minded government as part of an initiative by French President Emmanuel Macron, who has been leading rescue efforts.
This political class, as we've known, does not care to listen about what the Lebanese people have been calling for since they rose up on October 17 onwards. This is part of the culmination of this counter-revolutionary effort that started from the moment people took to the streets.
Lebanon has been left with a caretaker administration since Hassan Diab resigned over the Beirut port explosion in August that killed nearly 200 people and devastated many neighborhoods in the Lebanese capital. The previous Prime Minister-designate, Mustafa Adib, was forced to step aside after failing to convince traditional parties to give up representation in cabinet. It's never an easy process in a divided political landscape where factions are allied with foreign powers.
Hariri is a favorite of the Western leaders. He's a regular in Washington and Paris. And so he is the most pro-Western leader in Lebanon. So in a way, this is a kind of a victory for the pro-Western front in Lebanon.
Hariri may have friends in the international community, but it's the other camp, led by the pro-Iranian Hezbollah, that holds political power. Hariri's return could be a step towards a deal. But for now, it doesn't signal an end to Lebanon's political crisis. Zena Khudr, Al Jazeera.
All right, well, let's go deeper on this story by bringing in Lebanese activist Jessica Obaid, who's a former analyst at the Chatham House think tank. She joins us by Skype from Beirut. Jessica, thanks for joining us. And of course, as we heard there, a year ago, we were talking about Saad Hariri having no option to resign in order to bring these protests under control. Now he's back again. Sounds like Groundhog Day for many. What's the reaction there? What's the response to people hoping that they may have seen the back of Saad Hariri last year?
So there's a wide feeling of despair, especially among the young generation in Lebanon and protesters. But if we want to keep expectations in check, that was bound to happen because so the system is a sectarian system that's built on power sharing of all these people coming in together. So they all need each other in a way to maintain their kind of business model and their vested interests in the system. So we've expected Hariri to come back. Change is not going to happen overnight in Lebanon. Despite the feeling among many Lebanese that we're back to square one. And probably actually we're worse than square one because what has happened in this 1 year period or what didn't happen, a lot of policy action could have been taken to mitigate the impact of the financial and economic crisis, and that didn't happen. And with the return of Hariri, we cannot expect actual serious reforms. So we're going back and we're going down, we're going to get worse in Lebanon, and everyone expects that. But also there are some sort of wins that maybe we can talk about next.
You touched on some of the catalogue of issues that Lebanon faces, the economic crisis being one of them. Could you give us a sense of the scale of the challenges that this new government faces as it tries to deal with these issues one by one?
Well, first, there's a need for serious reforms and austerity measures. Which the government is going to have troubles implementing, even if they want to implement reforms, because they need citizens' buy-in, so the trust is completely absent, and there's a wide gap between people, the citizens and the government, especially a government led by Hariri. And then Lebanon has no inflows of hard currency, so that needs to be tackled through probably a package with the IMF and also other bilateral multilateral financial support. And that's not going to happen unless the government is very serious on reforms. But also, how can we expect the same people who got Lebanon into all this huge financial and economic crisis to actually be able to steer Lebanon away from it? It's like Lebanon has been doing the exact same thing, reappointing the exact same people and expecting a different outcome. And as you know, this is exactly the definition of insanity.
We've heard time and time again about the urgent need for reform in the country. What do you understand is holding the authorities back from implementing these reforms?
Vested interest. So there's a high level of corruption and vested interest across the value chain in different sectors in Lebanon that's linked to all these political parties and all these people. And so they've been splitting pieces of the cake, and now there's no longer cake to split, but they're still trying to make probably deals on future expectations of probably some money flowing into Lebanon. And we all know that the international community is telling them over and over again that you're not going to get any kind of support if you're not going to implement reforms. But we also know that the government is not going to implement reforms. So we're stuck in a vicious circle in a way.
Okay, Jessica Obaid, activist, speaking to us on Skype from Beirut. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, there's a lot more still to come this hour. Still on the streets, tens of thousands of Thai protesters continue their calls for reform after the government cancels its emergency decree. And as the Belarus opposition movement wins Europe's top human rights prize, the country's interior minister says protests there are turning into a terrorist threat.
Hello, we've got some decent spells of dry weather across eastern parts of Europe at the moment, but we have got some wetter weather over towards the west. Bands of cloud and rain still streaming in from the Atlantic. We'll keep it unsettled, but not as unsettled as it has been over the past few days. So wetter weather moving through Spain and Portugal for a time, but some heavy downpours, possibly some localised flooding, moving in across central and southern parts of France over towards the Alps. And wetter weather also creeping into Germany, and some blustery showers rolling in across the northwest there for Ireland and the UK. A little bit of wet weather over towards that eastern side of Europe too. Moscow at around 13 Celsius, so at least it's warming up, but I'm afraid getting a little wetter in the process. Clearer skies follow on as we go on through Saturday. Some showers there into Poland, into Belarus, and that wetter weather moving across the Alps, feeding over into the Balkans. But brighter skies do come back in behind for the southwest. Up towards the northwest, horrible looking band of cloud and rain swirling in a proper autumn storm. So wet and blustery weather to be expected as we go through the weekend. Bits and pieces of wet weather too into northwestern parts of Africa, maybe the odd shower into northern Libya and Egypt, and then showers there for the central belt.
A reminder of the top stories here on Al Jazeera. France is extending its curfew on 9 major cities to a further 38 areas. This means around 46 million people will now have to stay indoors at night. It comes as the country reported a record 41,500 new cases. Nigeria's president has called for an end to protests that began 2 weeks ago against police brutality. But in a speech to the nation, Muhammadu Buhari failed to mention the fatal shooting of protesters on Tuesday. The confirmation vote of US Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett is set to go ahead on Monday after the Senate Judiciary Committee approved her nomination. This as presidential candidates Donald Trump and Joe Biden are in Nashville preparing for their final presidential debate in about 3.5 hours. Well, let's talk more about the debate with Alan Schroeder, who's a professor at Northeastern University and the author of Presidential Debates, Risky Business on the Campaign Trail. He joins us live from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Alan, thanks for your time. Firstly, let me start by asking you, who's in the riskier position here in the debate? Is it Biden with apparently an 8.5% advantage, according to some polls, or is it Trump?
Well, there's always risk. There's always risk because it's live TV and anything can happen. But I actually think that Biden probably has the easier job to do tonight, just protecting his lead, not doing anything to get in the way of that trajectory that you just mentioned, whereas Trump really has to turn things around. That's a much harder thing to do.
Can elections really be won and lost on these kind of debates, especially given such a vast number of people? What is it? 30 million people have already cast their vote.
Yeah, something like a quarter of the population has already cast its vote. And add to that the fact that this year there are very few undecided voters to begin with. So this debate probably won't have a huge effect on the outcome of the election, and generally they don't. But you always have those last-minute people, and you always have the people that haven't been paying rapt attention all along, for whom the debate is useful and maybe even helps them decide how they're going to vote.
What about the role of debates like this in restoring public confidence and faith in the political system? I mean, after the first debate that ended up in a cacophony of noise, there was disappointment from both sides of the political spectrum there in the US. And now, of course, we know that there is this all-important mute button. So each of the candidates will have a chance to speak without interruption. Is there much faith left in this kind of format?
I think so. I think, really we've been doing this in the U.S. for 60 years now, and this is the first cycle where things just totally went off the rails. I think it has really much more to do with a particular candidate than with the idea of debates or the format or the moderator or any of those other things. So, yeah, I'm not ready to sort of write off the debates as an antiquated thing of the past. I think that they can still serve a purpose, but ideally with better candidates.
And can you give us a sense of the key issues? Because we gather there are at least 6 points that each of the candidates will have to address one by one.
Right. Yes. Coronavirus, which is something that obviously doesn't play to Trump's strengths. They'll be talking about climate change. They'll be talking about the economy. They'll be talking about American families. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but I guess we'll find out. And they'll be talking about leadership. So it's some of the same ground that they at least tried to cover last time. But of course, last time they didn't talk much substance. It was a little more theatrics than that.
No, somebody who's written a book on the impact of presidential debates. How do you even go about preparing for a situation like this? We know that Joe Biden's been keeping a low profile for the past few days. I wonder what he's been up to.
He's been in sort of this debate boot camp where they run him through the paces. They'll do full-length mock debates where they run a whole 90 minutes. They'll have a stand-in for Trump. They'll have a stand-in for the moderator. And they'll hit Biden with everything that Trump might possibly throw at him as well, in the hope that that prepares him for what could happen on the live TV. Now, on the other hand, Trump has not been preparing much at all. And so, that's part of the contrast that I think we'll see tonight. One debater who is prepared to discuss the issues in question, and another who is probably going to rely more on stylistics than any policy issues to talk about.
Well, it looks like it's going to be an almighty, if somewhat unpredictable, head-to-head. Alan Schroeder in Albuquerque, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our official results from 37 out of 38 of Guinea's voting districts show President Alpha Condé winning a third term with a landslide victory. Since Sunday's election, at least 10 people have been killed and dozens of others injured when security forces fired at supporters of opposition presidential candidate Cellou Dalein Diallo. He's disputing the results, as Nicholas Hack reports.
For a brief moment, the gunfire stops, interrupted by families who are in mourning. Mamadou Saidou Diallo, 14 years old, Cherno Nassirou Sila, 13 years old, and 10-year-old Umar Diallo. These young victims were shot by security forces, some in the face, while they were celebrating candidate Cellou Dalein Diallo's preliminary victory announcement in Sunday's presidential vote.
The military fire on children, small boys, 10 to 20 years old. They never pick on real men. I hope that their death will not go in vain and that the violence will stop.
After the election commission known as the CENI announced some of the provisional results, all in favor of incumbent President Alpha Condé, Diallo's supporters took to the streets in protest.
We don't trust the CENI because we have our own figures, and our own figures have nothing to do with the CENI. Nothing to do with the CENI. And it's important to look about what happened during the electoral process. The military took the ballot boxes. In some places, it was not possible for us in Canton to make campaign and to make our voice heard.
Mobile phone footage circulating on social media like this one showing election officials penning votes in favor of the president is deepening mistrust in the electoral process. The 82-year-old president amended the constitution earlier this year, which allowed him to run for a third term in office. The decision sparked widespread criticism and protests. President Condé believes he will win the final vote, which is expected this weekend. Meanwhile, the government is accusing Diallo of fomenting unrest by announcing his victory before the official election results.
Alpha Condé is a Democrat. He will accept the outcome no matter the result.
Additional mobile phone footage shows the military taking position inside Fulani neighborhoods known to support Diallo. Power has been cut and people live in fear. Look at these dogs, comments the woman filming. They're shooting our people. Over 10 people have died and scores have been injured, shot by security forces using force to silence dissent against a population it is meant to protect, not kill. Nicholas Hawk, Al Jazeera.
At least 12 civilians have been killed in an Afghan military attack targeting Taliban fighters. The airstrike hit a school in the northeastern province of Taqa on Thursday. Officials say an investigation is underway. It comes as peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban continue in Qatar. As Filio Contrafori reports from Kabul, citizens are growing tired of the unrest.
Mohammed Nasir sits in his empty shop and waits for the customers that have stopped coming, but mostly he's waiting for the peace that has yet to come.
We are very tired of this war. There is a war here from the last 40 years and we spent all our lives in the war. When we see the current situation, it really hurts us.
But for the United States, its longest war is showing signs of ending. The largest American military base here, Bagram, near Kabul, is reducing its size. President Donald Trump said he wants all American troops home by Christmas, but the Pentagon and State Department say 2,500 troops will remain into next year. Afghan business owners at the bazaar near Bagram base have been losing customers because of the withdrawal, and along with them, hope for the future.
We have no hope from the government. When they're asking for your vote, they make a lot of good promises about our future, but when they're in power, they don't fulfill those promises. They even took the bread from our table.
Government forces and the Taliban are again fighting in the southern province of Helmand, where tens of thousands have been forced from their homes and dozens of schools closed.
Throughout the decades of war in Afghanistan, as well as the military casualties, civilians have often been caught in the crossfire. And Afghans have repeatedly called for a ceasefire to let the peace talks in Doha progress.
But the ceasefire isn't happening. Analysts say the various sides are increasing their attacks to gain leverage in the peace negotiations. And while talks have not reached a make-or-break point, if they fail, Tamim Azay says, the stakes for the country are too high.
We already have people in Afghanistan rearming because they say, well, the Americans are leaving, the Afghan government might hold for a while, and we should defend ourselves. And I hope Taliban realize that, because then this war will become really Afghanized, and it will turn into a civil war, into a sectarian war, into an ethnic war, and that will be very bloody.
Afghans hope history won't be repeating itself, and the repetition of the bloodshed that followed the Soviet withdrawal 30 years ago. Filio Contrafuri, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
A roadside bomb has killed a senior cleric in the Syrian capital, Damascus. It happened in the town of Qudsaya, just west of the capital. State media has confirmed the Sunni Muslim Mufti of Damascus, Sheikh Mohammed Adnan Afghani, was killed. So far, no group has claimed responsibility. Tens of thousands of demonstrators have been back out in Thailand demanding the Prime Minister's resignation and reform of the monarchy. This after Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-o-cha cancelled last week's emergency decree banning gatherings of more than 4 people, which most people had ignored. Protesters rallied outside Government House and said they'd be back in 3 days unless Chan-o-cha stepped down. Scott Heidler reports from Bangkok.
Sirawit Se Lee Tiwat started speaking out against the government 6 years ago. That's when the current Prime Minister, Prayut Chan-o-cha, led a coup that ousted the democratically elected government. He's now working with the protesters who have been coming out to Thailand's streets by the tens of thousands. The demonstrations started in July and ramped up last week with a gathering every day. What's different now from 6 years ago? A call for reform of the monarchy.
The people lost their faith in the royal institution. We can't deny that. If we don't talk about the monarchy openly, people will gossip about it eventually. The monarchy and the status quo have 2 choices. Either use violence like they did in the past, or change and preserve their status.
Unwavering in his mission to bring about reform and change, he says he was attacked last year for being outspoken, beaten so badly he spent 2 weeks in hospital. But he's not stopping.
I'm proud to be Thai, but I'm reluctant to tell the world that I'm Thai. We have been taught to obey and not question authority. I feel that we were blinded in the past.
And the thousands across the country are working to put that past behind them. Scenes like this are grabbing attention across Thailand and across the world, expressing the desire for monarchy reform, something unthinkable even just earlier this year. But there is an opposing view, and it's not just limited to Government House or the palace. Wearing yellow, showing their allegiance to the monarchy, those who support the king have also held rallies over the last few months. They've been much smaller, but some supporters say that could change. Warong Dejkit Vigram was a member of parliament with the largest Conservative Party, but lost his seat in last year's election to a pro-reform party candidate.
I think there are more people who disagree with the current protests on the streets, but we must be patient. I believe that we will see more movement from those who want to protect the monarchy, but it will be peaceful. I think the voice of the younger people and the students are a minority.
Regardless of the actual numbers on either side of the issue, there's no dispute that the voices are getting louder of those who want change and to shake up Thailand's long-established power structure. Scott Heidler, Al Jazeera, Bangkok.
Investment bank Goldman Sachs will pay almost $3 billion in penalties for its role in the Malaysian 1MDB corruption scandal. The settlement comes after its Malaysian subsidiary pleaded guilty to violating bribery laws and admitted to paying more than $1 billion to foreign officials to win business. A 5-year investigation into the scandal involved authorities in nearly 9 different countries. Still ahead this NewsHour. Anger in Poland after the country's top court bans almost all abortions. And the hunt for Georgia's most wanted man. Dozens of hostages freed, but the gunman disappears with $500,000. Turkey says it will send troops to Nagorno-Karabakh if requested by Azerbaijan. But Russia says any Turkish military deployment will only make things worse. Azerbaijan and Armenia have been fighting over the disputed region for more than 3 weeks, despite 2 ceasefire deals. Nagorno-Karabakh is internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, but controlled by ethnic Armenians. The fighting is having a devastating impact on people on both sides of the conflict. In Azerbaijan, thousands of people have been forced to leave their homes. And more than 3 weeks after the fighting started, many are struggling to survive. Hoda Abdul Hamid met some of them in Barda in central Azerbaijan.
By the side of this road, they watched the war unfolding a few kilometers away. With each explosion, they wonder what was hit. Shirinova Mohammed has been living in his car for the past month. From here, he can monitor his village now trapped in the conflict zone.
We stay here because we have to take care of our harvest and our land. When it calms down, we rush there to see what has been hit and feed the animals, and then we come back. We try to go there 3 times a day.
A short drive away, more people are escaping the battlefield. They've managed to bring their livestock to safety. They tell us their village has also come under fire. This should have been cotton picking season, but there's barely anyone left here to harvest. The war has expanded with random shelling reaching well beyond the line of contact. So for this year, the crops are going to waste. About 100,000 people have fled their homes, living in schools that have shut because of the conflict. Many had already been displaced since Armenia occupied their land in the 1990s. Salimova Jamale has lived as a displaced person for most of her life. Her family fled the Karabakh region and settled in Terter. Now the war has caught up with her.
I remember when Armenia was bombing and our house was hit. My sister was 11. She was wounded and my brother was killed. I remember all of this. It's engraved in my memory. When Terter got bombed, I ran away with my 3 children. I had lived through all of this already, so I was scared for them. I already knew these sounds, but they didn't.
But these are different times for Azerbaijan. It now has a well-equipped army. So when Suleymanova Narmina's son said he wanted to volunteer, she gave him her blessing.
He is sad because he got injured. I told him it's for the sake of Karabakh. We have to get our land back, no matter the cost. If I could, I would join the fight right now.
It's been 26 years since Azerbaijan was defeated by Armenia. But now, its army is making territorial gains, and there's a growing hope among many here that they will soon return to their lost land. Hoda Abdul Hamid, Al Jazeera, Barda.
The opposition movement in Belarus has won the European Parliament's highest human rights award, the Sakharov Prize. For weeks, hundreds of thousands of people have taken part in nationwide protests and strikes in the country, calling for an end to President Alexander Lukashenko's 26-year rule. Sonia Gallego reports.
an announcement.
It is a great honor to inform you that the Conference of the Presidents has decided to give the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought to the democratic opposition in Belarus.
A message:
continue to be strong and continue to fight your fight and your struggle. We will stand by your side.
And applause. A show of unity from the European Union, which has condemned the political repression in Belarus. And it is the women of the opposition movement who have been at the forefront since the August presidential elections. While Alexander Lukashenko remains in control after 26 years, the opposition continues to call for a peaceful transfer of power in response to what they and the West say was a rigged vote.
I'm really glad that we've got such award, because this is award not only for for me. It's a award of all the Belarusian people, because now we like one organism who is fighting against regime.
Among the finalists of the award, the Archbishop of Mosul, Najib Mikhail, who helped Iraqi Christians escape the onslaught of ISIL and safeguarded more than 800 historic manuscripts. And Berta Cáceres and Gupinol defenders, the Honduran indigenous activists who fought against illegal logging and land grabs. Cáceres was assassinated in 2016 by armed intruders in her home after years of threats against her life. The award, together with EU sanctions, may renew international pressure on Lukashenko. But inside Belarus, tens of thousands of people have continued to march through the streets of the capital, Minsk, every weekend. Despite the police brutality, the jailing of members of the opposition and the muzzling of independent media, their fight goes on. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera.
Well, the opposition may have been honoured, but their protests are being called a terrorist threat by the Belarusian government. Earlier, the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service flew to Minsk in what looked like a show of support for Alexander Lukashenko. The two men have accused the US and its Western allies of fueling the protests. Poland's top court has ruled that a law allowing abortions due to fetal defects is unconstitutional. The decision means terminations are now almost totally banned. Abortions will only be allowed in the case of rape, incest, or if the pregnancy threatens the mother's health. Poland's opposition says the court is carrying out the political will of the conservative ruling party.
I cannot get my head around a situation in which I'm forced to give birth to a child who is going to die. This is traumatic for everyone. For 9 months you'll be carrying a child with serious genetic defects, which you know is not going to live very long. This is traumatic for a woman, for her whole family and everyone else around her. I hope that maybe in 20 or 30 years that the next generations will have easy access to abortion.
A manhunt is underway in Georgia for a bank robber armed with guns and a hand grenade who held 43 people hostage. He escaped with $500,000 after negotiating his way out of the standoff. Robin Forestier-Walker in Tbilisi has more.
CCTV from inside this Bank of Georgia branch in Zugdidi shows a gunman, well armed and seemingly well trained, terrorizing staff and customers. Hostages were asked to contact the media. One of them relayed his demands to a TV station. $500,000 in cash and safe passage. Armed police units waited. Officials pledged with the media to stop broadcasting live from the scene.
We demand from all media outlets, including mobile operators, to cut off, restrict the live signal in order to ensure the safety of hostages, law enforcers and ordinary citizens, in order to effectively conduct police measures.
But there were to be no police measures. Some hostages were released. Then, after lengthy negotiations, more were freed, some clearly traumatized, in exchange for cash, it's alleged, and the local chief of police. He and 3 other hostages emerged as human shields, with the gunman holding what appeared to be a grenade. In Georgia, there's been relief that nobody was harmed, but also disbelief that this gunman, whose identity remains unknown, was able to get away with such a brazen crime. After the final hostages were released, the gunman reportedly escaped into a forest, not far from the breakaway region of Abkhazia, where local media speculated he might seek refuge. The search is now on to catch Georgia's most wanted man. Robin Forestier Walker, Al Jazeera, Tbilisi.
Well, that's it from me, Niamh Barker, for this news hour, but I'll be back in a moment with more of the day's news. Don't go away.